Tonight, we are going to slow down together and wander quietly through a world that is great gone, a world of ships and lamps and long, dark water, a world without hurry, a world that reminds you of something easy to forget. That while is considerable, that tonight does not need anything from you. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. It is quietly comforting to know who else is awake tonight. You do not need to know anything about history to listen. There will be no dates to remember and nothing to keep track of. You do not need to follow the story. You only need to be here. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Thank you for joining us here at Midnight Archive. Let us begin. Long ago, in a city by the sea, a very extended siege came to an end. This is not a story about the fighting. It is a story about the night after it. The fighting was over. The city was quiet, and on the long gray beach below the walls, a few hundred tired men were getting ready to go home. Picture that beach for a moment. It is wide and flat and stony. The sea comes in slowly on the left, in low folds, without much sound. Behind the men, the walls of the old city stand dark against a darker sky. Ahead of them, drawn up on the sand in a far uneven row, sit their ships, black hulls, bare masts, ropes hanging loose in the still air. There were fires along that beach. They were not large, small ones, driftwood and old rope, and whatever else would burn. The men sat around them in twos and threes, not saying much. You might expect celebration. There was not very much of it. It was not that kind of night. 10 years is a long stretch to be away from a place. By the end, most of them had stopped talking about home the way they used to. They had stopped describing their houses. They had stopped saying the names of their fields out loud. They just wanted to go. There was, on that beach, a man mending a sail. He had done this many times. He knew the work with his hands, and he did not need much light for it. He sat with the heavy cloth across his knees, and he pushed a bone needle through it slowly and pulled the cord through after. The sail smelled of salt and old smoke. Everything on that beach smelled of salt and old smoke. He worked without hurrying. There was no reason to hurry. There is never much reason to hurry at sea. The ships would not go out that night. They would go out in the morning, or the wind was right and the water was calm. Sailors have always known how to wait. It is most of what the work is. Near him, another man was coiling rope. This is one of the oldest kinds of work there is. You lay the rope over your palm in loops, one loop over another, and you keep them even, and you keep them loose, so that later, when the rope is needed quickly, it comes free without a knot. He coiled the rope. He set it down. He picked up another and started again. Time moved slowly on that beach. Further along, someone was scraping the bottom of a boat. Barnacles come off with a flat blade in small dry strips, and it is a sound you can hear from a distance. Scrape, pause, scrape. It went on for a wide while. Someone else was checking the pitch on a hull. Pitch is the black tar that keeps the sea out of the wood. It goes on warm and hardens dull, and after a season it cracks, and the cracks have to be found by hand in the dark, one at a season with the fingers. He ran his hand along the wood. He found a crack. He marked it. He kept going. This was not interesting work. That is exactly why it is worth telling you about. This is what the end of a very famous story actually looked like from the sand. Men with sore hands, fixing things, in the dark, before a long trip. The captain of one of those ships walked down the beach that night. He was not a young man anymore. He had come here a young man, and the 10 years had gone through him the way weather goes through a rope. He had a way of standing with his weight on one leg. He had a beard that was going gray at the edges. He had a house somewhere far to the west on a small stony island, and he had not seen it in a very slow time. He walked past the fires. Men nodded at him. He nodded back. He was counting his ships. He had done this every night for years now. Not because he expected the number to change, but because counting them was a thing he could do, and it made the evening feel finished. 12 ships, 12 dark shapes on the sand. He stopped near the last one and looked out at the water. The sea at night from a beach does not look like anything. It looks like a wide dark, nothing that moves a little. You can hear it more than you can see it. It comes in and it goes out, in and out, with a long space between. He listened to it for a while. Home was somewhere out in that dark. It was, he knew, a great distance. He had made the crossing once in the other direction, and he remembered it as a matter of some weeks. Weeks of open water and small islands, and nights like this one. He thought it would take him a season perhaps less, with good wind. He was wrong about that, but he did not know it yet, and there is no reason for us to tell him tonight. Let him stand on the sand and think about a season. A man came up beside him, an older sailor, someone who had been at sea since he was a boy, and who had, by now, very few opinions left about anything. They stood together for a while without talking. Then the older man said something about the wind. He said it would not come tomorrow. He said it would come the day after from the north, and it would be steady, and it would hold. He said he could feel it in the way the smoke was lying flat over the fires. The captain asked him how he knew. The old sailor said he did not really know. He said he had just been watching smoke for 50 years, and after a while, the smoke tells you things. That was all. He went back to his fire. The captain stayed a while longer. There is a particular feeling in being about to leave a place you have hated. It is not joy. It is not relief, exactly. It is closer to tiredness. He had thought about this beach for so great that he had worn the thought smooth, and now that it was almost over, he felt very little. He thought about the door of his house. He could not, That night, remember which way it opened, inward or outward. He turned it over for a while and could not settle it. That is what 10 years does. It takes the small things first. A word about ships like those, since we are going to be on one for most of tonight. They were not large. A man could walk the length of one in a zanus paces. They were built shell first, which means the planks were fitted edge to edge and pegged together before any of the ribs went in. The ribs came afterwards to stiffen what was already a shape. That is the opposite of how ships were built later. It is slower. It takes a great deal of skill in the hands and very little in the way of drawings. Everything on board was made of things that grow: wood, flax, wool, leather, pitch from pine trees. There was some bronze in the fittings and very little iron anywhere. Rope was the most valuable thing on the ship after the sail. Good rope took months to make. It wore out constantly. Every sailor spent part of every week working on it. The sail was a single square of woven cloth, and someone had woven it by hand at a loom over many weeks. That is true of every sail in this whole story. Somebody's hands made all of them, thread by thread. You could take one of those ships apart and put it back together on a beach with hand tools. They did, often. That is why they could sail so far in them. None of that made them comfortable, but it made them repairable. Out on that sea, repairable was worth more. He went back up the beach. The fires were lower now. Some of the men were already asleep, lying on the sand with their cloaks pulled over them, the way sailors sleep everywhere, without much ceremony. Others sat awake, staring at the coals, not doing anything. He walked among them slowly. Someone had finished the sail. It lay folded now, a pale heap in the dark, ready to be carried aboard. Someone had finished the rope, and it sat in neat rings by the hull. Someone had stopped scraping. The work was done, or done enough. There was nothing else to lift, and nothing else to mend. There was a boy on that beach, too. There is always a boy. He was one of the rowers, and he had come out here as a child, and was now something like a man. And he had never known any other life than this one. He asked the captain what the island was like, the one they were going to. The captain thought about it. He said it was small. He said it was stony and poor, and that the goats did well there and not much else. He said there was a harbor on one side and hills on the other, and that from the top of the hills you could see the sea on every side. The boy asked if it was beautiful. The captain said no. He said it was not beautiful. He said it was just his. Then he said the thing that the boy remembered afterwards. He said that a place does not have to be beautiful for you to want to be lying down in it. The boy laughed a little. Then he lay down and went to sleep. The captain sat by the fire for a long period after that. The night went on around him. The sea came in and went out. Somewhere down the beach, a rope creaked against wood. Somewhere further off, a dog was barking in the ruined city at nothing. The stars turned overhead slowly, the way they do. They were the same stars he would use to steer by. He knew them the way you know the road home. That one there, low and steady, that never left the north. That group there, that rose in the summer, that bright one that came up before dawn. He would not need to think about them for weeks yet, but he looked at them anyway. There is something quiet in the hours, just before a considerable journey. The bags are packed, the work is finished, there is nothing left to do but wait, and nothing left to decide. That is where he was that night. The fire went down to red. He put another piece of wood on it, and it caught slowly, and the light came back a little, and then it went down again. He did not sleep for a while. You do not have to keep track of any of this. There will be no test in the morning. This is only a man on a beach at the end of one thing and the beginning of another, waiting for wind. 10 years he had waited to leave. He would wait a little longer. The wind came the day after, from the north, exactly as the old sailor had said. The smoke had been right. But that was later. Tonight, the beach was still. The ships were still. The men were sleeping on the sand with their cloaks over them. The work was quiet. It did not need to be watched. It only needed to be finished. And it was, slowly, hull by hull, along that long gray beach on the last night at Troy. Let us wander somewhere else now. There is another corner of the past that holds the same quiet. It is out on the water, a few days later, with no land in sight at all. Picture a ship, not a large one. It is extended and low and open to the sky, with a single mast in the middle and a single square sail, and along each side, a row of benches for the men who row. There is no deck to walk on. There is no cabin. There is nowhere to go. It is not a house that floats. A ship like this is a long open box on the water, and everyone on it lives in the same room. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Every one of those men spent years in a space you could cross in a few steps. By evening, the wind had gone. This happens often on that sea. The wind comes up in the morning and pushes all day, and then, near sunset, it simply stops, the way a conversation stops. The sail goes soft, the rope goes slack. The ship keeps moving for a while out of habit, and then it does not. The men shipped their oars. This is a small ceremony that happened every night for 10 years, and it is worth describing slowly. Each man lifts his oar out of the water. He turns it. He lays it lengthwise along the inside of the hull, blade forward, handle back, and he settles it into its place beside the oar of the man in front of him. There is a sound to this, a wooden knock, then another, going down the length of the ship as each man finds his place. Then it is quiet. You have to understand how quiet. There was no engine. There was nothing humming anywhere. There was the water against the hull, which is a small slapping sound, irregular, never quite the same twice. There was the rope moving against the mast. There was a man coughing somewhere near the front. That was all there was to hear for hours. They ate a little. It was not much of a meal. Bread that had gone hard and was softened in water, olives. Sometimes cheese, if any had lasted. A little wine, cut with a great deal of water in a shallow cup, passed along the bench. Nobody ate much at sea. There was no room to be hungry properly. Something about how those ships actually moved, because it is not what most people picture. They rode when there was no wind, and they sailed when there was, and they never did both seriously at the same time. The sail was single and square, and it pushed well from behind and poorly from anywhere else. A square sail cannot work close to the wind. That is the whole limitation of the age. If the wind was against you, you waited. You did not tack up into it the way a later ship could. So a journey of that kind was never a straight line. It was a series of short hops between islands, with far pauses on beaches, waiting for the weather to come round. That is why 10 years is possible. Not because the distance was great. The distance was a matter of weeks. It is because a ship like that goes when the sea allows it, and stops when it does not, and there is no arguing with either. Then the light went. The going of the light on open water is slow, and it is worth watching. First the sun goes, and the sky stays bright for a long while afterwards, orange low down and green above it, and then blue. Then the sea turns from blue to gray, to a kind of dark that is not really a color. Then the stars come, a few at a spell, and then all at once. At sea, with no land and no lamps anywhere, there are a very great number of stars. More than most of us have ever seen. They come down to the water on every side, so that the horizon is a ring of them, and it becomes difficult to tell where the sky stops. The men lay down between the benches. There is no comfortable way to sleep on a ship like that. You lie on the boards with your cloak under you or over you, and your knees are up, because there is not room to straighten them, and the wood is wet, and the wood is hard, and it never stops moving. They slept anyway. It does not have to be comfortable. People sleep anywhere, eventually. There was one man awake near the stern. He was steering, or holding the steering oar at least, which at night with no wind is mostly a way of staying awake with something in your hands. He was young, younger than most of them. He had a wife at home and a child he had seen for about a year and then not at all. He was trying that night to remember his wife's face. This is a thing that happens to people who are away for a wide time, and it is one of the sadder small facts about long absence. The face goes first, not the person. The person stays complete in the way you feel about them. But the actual face, the exact arrangement of it, comes apart slowly, and after a few years you find you are remembering a description rather than a picture. He could remember that her hair was dark and that she wore it up in the mornings. He could remember that she was shorter than him by about a hand. He could remember the sound of her laughing at something, though not what. He could not put the face together. This did not upset him. He was not troubled by it. He had noticed it before, and he had made a kind of peace with it. He simply went through it again, on nights like that one, the way you press a sore tooth with your tongue. An older man was awake, too, further forward. He came back along the benches, stepping carefully over the sleeping men, and sat down near the steering oar. They talked for a while, in the low voices people use at night, which are not really whispers, just quiet. The young man told him about the face. He was slightly embarrassed to say it out loud. The old man was not surprised. He said it happened to everyone. He said that he had not been able to picture his own mother for many years, and that it had frightened him at first, and then stopped frightening him. The young man asked how it stopped. The old man said that one day he understood that he had not lost her. He said that he had only lost the picture, and that a picture is a small thing to carry, and that you do not need it to love someone. Then he said the thing the young man kept. He said, "You will see her face again, and it will not match what you remember, and you will not care at all." Then he went back to his bench and lay down. The ship moved on the swell, not going anywhere, just moving. You would have felt that motion in your whole body. It is a slow lift and a slow settle over and over, with a small roll in it. Sailors stop noticing it after a week. For the first days, it is all you can think about, and then it becomes the floor. The young man held the steering oar and watched the north. There was a star there that did not move. Everything else in the sky went slowly around it over the course of a night, in a great slow wheel, and that one stayed. Sailors have used it for as slow as there have been sailors. He kept it off his left shoulder. That was all the navigation there was. The night went on. The stars turned. The water slapped the hull. He thought about his island, the harbor with its stone quay, the road going up from the water between low walls, the house at the top with the courtyard and the olive tree in it, and the smell of that courtyard in the evening, which was dust and leaves and smoke. He could remember the courtyard perfectly. He could not remember the face. That is how memory works, and there is no arguing with it. Somewhere near the middle of the night, the wind came back a little, not much, enough to move the sail once and make the rope creak, and then it went again. He did not wake anyone. There was no point. It was not enough wind to matter. Later, the sky in the east went from black to a very dark blue, and then to gray, and the stars there went out one by one. This takes a long while. It is not sudden, and it is not dramatic. It is closer to something dissolving than to something arriving. The men began to stir. Somebody sat up and rubbed his face. Somebody else went to the side of the ship for a while and came back. A word about the rowing. since it is most of what they did. The oar is great, and it is heavy, and it pivots against a peg in the rail. You sit on a bench with your feet braced. You lean back and pull, and then you come forward and lift the blade clear, and then you do it again. The rate is slow, slower than people imagine. Somewhere around 20 strokes a minute for a long haul, all day, everyone together. Together is the difficult part. A boat where the oars are out of time goes nowhere and everyone gets hurt. So somebody calls it, or somebody sings it, and the whole boat moves as one animal. You do that for 6 or 8 hours. Then you stop. The hands go first, then the back, and after a season, neither of them complains anymore. That is what those bodies were. Not strong exactly, but entirely used to it. The oars came out again. The same wooden knocking, in reverse, down the length of the hull. They began to row. This is the whole shape of it. Row through the day, ship the oars at dusk, lie down between the benches, get up and row. They did this for 10 years, not the storms and the islands. Those were the exceptions. The ordinary substance of that journey was a considerable open boat on quiet water, and a great many nights of nothing happening at all. The young man handed off the steerer and lay down where he was, in the space he had just left, and slept for 2 hours in the growing light. Nobody woke him early, nobody hurried him. The work was slow. It did not need to be finished quickly. It only needed to go on, and it did, day after day, out on the flat water, a very long way from anywhere. Stretch moved on, slowly, as it always does, and somewhere else, on another shore, there was a different kind of night. Consider now a different shore in a warmer part of that sea. It is said that somewhere on that extended way home, the ships came to an island where the people ate a fruit that made them forget. We do not know where it was. We do not know if it was anywhere. The old accounts are vague about it in the way that old accounts often are, and that vagueness is part of what makes the place worth visiting tonight. It is a soft island. There are no hard edges anywhere on it. It is not a place you could draw. Picture it then, the way it was told. There is a low shore, sand that goes back a long way before it becomes anything else. Behind the sand, trees with wide, flat leaves, and under the trees, quiet shade that moves. The water there was very clear and very warm. You could stand in it up to your knees and see your own feet and small fish going over them, unhurried. The ships came in at the end of a far day of rowing. The men were tired in the particular way that rowing makes you tired, which is in the back and the hands and nowhere else. They pulled the ships up onto the sand. That is heavy work, done all together, with everyone leaning on the hull and someone counting. Then it was done, and they stood on land, and the ground was still under them, and it felt strange, the way it always does for the first hour. The people of that island came down to meet them. They were not afraid of the ships. This This is not what strangers usually meet. That was the first thing anyone noticed. They came down the beach without hurrying and without weapons, and they looked at the strangers with a kind of mild friendliness, the way you look at weather. They brought food. They brought it without being asked, in flat baskets, and they set it down on the sand and sat down beside it. There was fruit in the baskets, pale, soft, sweet. The captain was careful. He had been careful for a very long time by then, and it had become less a decision than a habit. He sent 3 men up the beach to see what was there, and he told them to come back before dark, and he stayed with the ships. The 3 men went. They walked up through the sand and into the shade of the wide-leafed trees. It was cooler there and very quiet. There was a path, or something like a path, going gently uphill. They came to a place where people were sitting. That is the whole of it, really. There was no city. There was no hall. There were simply people in the shade, sitting, and some of them were eating the pale fruit, and some of them were not doing anything at all. Somebody offered the sailors the fruit. They took it, because they were guests, and because it would have been rude not to, and because they were hungry. It tasted of honey and of something else. Here is where the story turns, and it turns very gently. The men did not fall down. They did not become ill. They did not lose their senses in any way you could point at. They simply stopped wanting to leave. It was not a decision. Picture one of them. He was a rower from a village on a stony hill, and he had a mother there and 2 brothers and a field of no great size that he had never much liked working. He sat down in that shade with the taste of the fruit still in his mouth. He thought about the field. He found that he could think about it perfectly well. He could see the wall around it and the bad corner where nothing grew. He simply did not want it anymore. That is the strange thing about that island in every version of the story. The forgetting was not a hole in the mind. It is not a hole at all. It was a loosening. The men remembered everything and cared about none of it. He thought about the ship, the bench, the oar, the wet boards and the salt in every seam of his clothes, and 10 years of it behind him, and no way of knowing how much in front. Then he looked at the shade and the sea beyond it, flat and warm and going nowhere, and he thought, I could stay. He said it out loud to the man next to him. The man next to him agreed. He had been thinking the same thing. Neither of them said anything more about it for a while. The light went wide and gold through the leaves. That is the light of late afternoon in a warm place, and it is one of the oldest sedatives there is. It comes in low, under the branches, and it makes everything the color of honey, and it makes it very hard to stand up. They did not stand up. We should be honest about how thin the record is here. There is no island anyone can point to. There is no fruit that anyone has identified with confidence, though people have tried. The guesses are all reasonable, and none of them are provable. What there is a very old story that keeps being retold, because everyone recognizes the feeling in it. That is worth more than a location for our purposes. A place on a map would be a fact to remember. A feeling that everyone recognizes is a place you can visit at night without effort. So we will leave it unlocated. Somewhere warm, off to the south, in the part of the map where old sailors drew things they had only heard about. Down on the beach, the captain waited. He waited through the last of the afternoon, and then through the going of the light, and then into the dark, and the three men did not come back. He was not alarmed at first. Men are late. But when the fires on the beach had been lit and had burned down once, he took some others and went up the path himself. He found them where they were sitting. They were perfectly well. That was the thing that unsettled him most. They looked up at him and they knew him, and they greeted him by name quite warmly. He asked them to come back to the ships. They said they would rather not. Not defiantly. Not as a refusal. They said it the way you decline. A second helping of something, with a small apologetic movement of the hand. He asked them again. They said the same thing in the same tone. There is a moment in this story that is often skipped over, and it is the interesting one. The captain stood there in the dark under those trees and understood something about his own men. He understood that they were not being weak. He understood that the fruit had not done anything to them, that 10 years had not already begun. It had only finished it. They were tired. That is all it was. They had been tired for a very long season, and here was a place with no wind to fight, and no rowing to do, and no distance left to cross, and someone was handing them food. He would have liked himself to sit down. He did not. He had them carried back to the ships. That part is told plainly in the old accounts, and there is not much to say about it. They were brought down the path and put aboard, and they wept a little in a mild way, and then they stopped. By the middle of the night, they were asleep on their benches like everyone else. The captain sat on the sand and looked at the dark shape of the island. You could not hear anything from up there. No voices, no music, no movement. The people in the shade were presumably still sitting in the dark now, without lamps, not needing them. He thought about how easy it would be. Not for the first time. There had been other places, and there would be more, and each of them offered some version of the same thing. Stop here. Stay. It is warm, and nobody is asking anything of you, and the sea will still be there in 100 years if you change your mind. He turned it over for a while. He did not decide it quickly. Then he thought about the courtyard of his own house, and the olive tree in it, and the fact that somebody was probably still sweeping that courtyard every day and had been for 10 years. That was the whole argument. It was not a noble one. He simply preferred his own tree. He put more wood on the fire. An older sailor sat down beside him after a while and said something quiet about the men who had eaten. He said they would be fine by morning. He said it wore off and that they would be embarrassed about it for a day, and then not think about it again. Then he said, "It is not a bad island." The captain agreed. He said it was not a bad island at all. He said that was the difficulty with it. They sat there together for a slow period without saying anything else. The beach was quiet. In the morning, they pushed the ships back down the sand. That is the same heavy work in reverse, with everyone leaning and someone counting, and it takes a while, and by the end of it, everybody is fully awake. The three men rowed. They did not talk about it. The island went small behind them, and then it went blue, and then it was a low line, and then it was gone. That is how islands leave you, slowly, without any moment you could point at. Nobody knows where it was. Nobody has ever found it. It is possible that there was no such island, and that the story is only a way of saying something true about tired men, which is that the thing that stops them is very rarely hardship. It is not usually hardship. It is usually somewhere pleasant. The sweetness was quiet. It did not need to argue. It only needed to be offered, and it was on a warm shore a very long time ago, to men who were a very great way from home. Let us wander somewhere else now. The old records hold a smaller moment that says the same thing. It happened, if it happened, inside a hill on an island of goats. We are not going to tell the part of this story that everyone knows. That part is loud, and it belongs to the daytime. We are going to sit in the hours before it, which nobody ever describes, and which were very long and very quiet. Picture a cave. Not a cave in the way you might imagine one. This was a shepherd's cave, a working place, lived in for many years, and it was tidy. There were pens along one side. They were built of stacked stone for the young animals. There were baskets. There were racks with cheeses on them, drying. They were arranged in rows by size. The small ones sat at the front. There were pails of milk along the wall. Some of them were curdling into whey. Some were still fresh. The floor was swept. That is the detail that stays with people. Somebody swept that floor. The men had come up from the shore in the afternoon looking for food because their own had run low. They had found the cave empty and open, and they had gone inside. They ate some of the cheese. They looked at the pens and the pails. They said to each other that whoever lived here was a serious sort of person, keeping cheeses in rows like that. Then the light at the mouth of the cave went dark. The shepherd came home. The mouth of the cave was closed with a stone. That is where we are going to stop the telling. What happened after belongs to another kind of night. Tonight, we are only going to stay in the hours in between, in the dark, with 12 men sitting against a wall. a word about caves like that one, because they were not unusual at all. Shepherds across that whole world used them. A cave is free, it is dry, it holds a steady temperature all year, and it needs no roof beams and no thatch. You build your pens inside it, out of stacked stone. You keep your cheeses on racks near the mouth where the air moves. You keep your fire toward the back. Cheese was the whole point of the operation. Milk does not keep. Cheese keeps for months, and it travels, and it can be traded. So a man alone on an island with a great many animals would spend most of his year turning something that spoils in a day into something that lasts a season. That is what all those pails and racks were. Not decoration, a working dairy inside a hill. There was a fire, that is worth knowing. The shepherd had built one at the back of the cave, and it burned all evening on dry brush and old wood, and it threw a very small light over a very large space. The cave was much bigger than they had thought. That is what a fire does in a cave. It shows you the size of the room by not reaching the edges of it. They could see the roof, faintly, a considerable way up, wet in places, with the light moving on it. They sat with their backs against the stone. Stone holds the heat of the day for a long spell, and then gives it back slowly through the night. If you have ever leaned against a wall in the evening in a hot country, you know this. The men would have felt it through their clothes that stored warmth for the first few hours. Nobody said very much. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes over people in a situation they cannot immediately do anything about. It is not panic. Panic is short. It is loud, and it burns itself out quickly. This was the thing that comes after panic, which is a sort of stillness. They had gone through the fast part already. They had gone to the stone and pushed at it and found it was far beyond moving. Then they had come back and sat down. So they sat. One man counted his breaths for a while. He had done this as a boy in the dark, and he found he could still do it. He counted up to 100 and lost the place, and started again and lost it again. One man slept. This surprises people, but human beings sleep in impossible circumstances, and often quite deeply. It is not rare at all. He put his head back against the stone, and he was gone within the hour. One man watched the animals. That is the thing that saved the evening, in a way. The cave was full of sheep and goats, penned along the wall, and they behaved exactly as sheep and goats always behave. They shifted, they pressed against one another. They made small complaining noises and settled and made them again. A great stone manor. There is nothing frightening about a pen of sheep. It is not a sound that alarms anyone. It is one of the oldest comfortable sounds there is. It filled that cave all night. The captain sat nearest the fire. He was, we are told, thinking. He was thinking hard and quickly in the way he had. He turned the situation over from several sides. This was the only part of the night that was not restful. But even that has a slowness in it. He was not going to do anything until morning. Whatever he came up with would have to wait for light. So the thinking had nowhere to go, and it went round, and eventually it wore itself smooth. He looked at the fire. There was not much of it left. He looked at the racks of cheeses in their rows, small at the front. There is something in that image that he apparently never forgot, because it comes down to us that the person who had closed the stone was also the person who had sorted the cheeses by size. Both things were true about him at once. He was a shepherd. He kept his floor swept. That is most of what is worth taking from this story tonight. The world is full of things that are silly the size they are. They are not thinking about you. They sort their cheeses. The fire went low. They did not build it up. There was wood there, but nobody wanted to move. The dark came in from the edges of the cave, slowly, the way it does when a fire is going down. First, the roof went, then the far wall, then the pens, so that the animals were only a sound and a warmth and a smell. The smell of a shepherd's cave is milk and wool and smoke. It is not an unpleasant smell at all, sharper than a house, warmer than outside. Somebody began to breathe evenly, then somebody else. It is a strange fact, and a true one, that on that night in that place, most of those men eventually slept. They lay down on a swept floor between the fire and the pens. Their bodies decided that the situation could wait until morning. They went under. The captain stayed awake the longest. Late in the night, he heard the shepherd, further back in the cave, turn over and settle. An enormous ordinary sound, a man moving in his sleep, which every one of us has heard from another room. Then the cave was quiet again, except for the animals. He looked up at the roof. The fire was almost out and he could not see it anymore, but he knew it was there, an extended way above, wet in places. He thought about the sea. He thought about the ship, drawn up on the sand below, and the men waiting on it, and the fact that they had food now, at least, in a manner of speaking. He thought about the morning. Then he stopped thinking about the morning, because it was still hours off, and because thinking about a morning that has not come is one of the few kinds of work that produce nothing at all. He put his head back against the stone. The stone was cool by then. It was not warm anymore. The heat of the day had gone out of it entirely, in the slow way it does over the course of a whole night, giving back in 12 hours what it took in 12 hours. He listened to the animals shifting in the pens. He was, we may reasonably imagine, very tired. He had been tired for years by then, and there is a point past which the body stops asking permission. He slept a little before it was light. That is all we are going to say about that cave. The rest of it is a story for other people, told loudly, and it has been told often enough. We are only here for the long hours in the middle, which nobody records, and which were dark and warm and full of sheep. The fire had gone out. It did not need to be relit. It only needed to have been there far enough, and it had been on a swept floor, inside a hill, on an island of goats, a very long time ago. Let us wander somewhere else now. Far from there and wide after, someone else was keeping a small light. This while it was a man at a steering oar who had not slept in 9 days. It is said that on a floating island of bronze walls, a king of the winds gave the captain a gift. The gift was a bag. It was not a small one, an ox-hide bag, sewn shut with silver wire, and inside it, so the story goes, were all the winds that blow from the wrong directions. Only one wind was left outside. It was not a hard wind. It was the west wind, the one that would push them home. Whether this happened is not something anyone can tell you. It has the shape of a thing that is told rather than a thing that is recorded. But it is a beautiful shape. And it is worth walking through slowly tonight because of what happens at the end of it, which is very human and very sad in a quiet way. Something about a following wind, because the story turns on 9 days of one. A wind from behind is the only wind that square sail truly loves. The cloth goes hard and round, the ropes take the strain, and the ship settles into a long, steady push. Nobody rows. That is the whole of it. 9 days without touching an oar. The motion is different too. Running before the wind, a ship lifts at the stern and slides forward, and then settles over and over, and the water goes past on both sides with a hiss. It is the most restful thing that ever happens on a ship of that kind. So, picture those men, for 9 days, sitting on benches they normally worked at, with nothing to do but eat and sleep and watch the water. After years of hauling, that is what was happening, while the captain stood at the oar and did not sleep. They sailed for 9 days. Think about that. 9 days of a steady wind from behind, which is the easiest sailing there is, the sail full and hard, the ship going along at a good pace with nobody rowing, the men with nothing to do but sit and watch the water go past. They must have been happy. It is not a difficult thing to picture. The old accounts do not say so, but 9 days of a following wind after years of trouble would make anyone happy. The captain steered. Here is the part that matters. He steered the whole way himself, 9 days. He would not give the oar to anyone. He had the bag lashed under the bench beside him, and he would not let anyone near it either. He did not explain the bag. That is the detail that undoes him, and it is worth pausing on. He never told the men what was in it. He simply kept it close and kept his hand on the oar and watched the horizon and said nothing. The men watched him do this for 9 days. They talked among themselves the way crews they had been at sea a slow while, and they had taken very little home with them, and they were beginning to notice that the captain had been given a great many gifts by a great many hosts along the way. They looked at the bag slowly over many days, silver wire, sewn shut, guarded. They decided there was treasure in it. You can see how they got there. It is not a foolish conclusion. It is not greed either. It is the conclusion almost anyone would reach, given 9 days to reach it and nothing else to think about. Meanwhile, the man at the oar was not sleeping. This is the physical center of the story. A steering oar has to be held. If you let it go, the ship falls off the wind, and the sail flaps and you lose the line. And he would not let anyone else take it because the whole thing depended on the wind holding and the course holding and nothing at all going wrong. So he stood there hour after hour, day after day, with his arm across the oar. The days went slowly. He would have been beyond tiredness by the end. There is a place past exhaustion where the world becomes very simple and very clear and slightly unreal, and he was living in it by the 9th day. On the 9th day, he saw the island. His own island, low on the horizon, small and stony, exactly where it should be. He could see the fires. That is the detail from the old accounts that stays in the mind. He was close enough to see the men on the shore tending their fires. Close enough to see the smoke going up. And then, with home in sight, he slept. He did not decide to. He simply came to the end of what a body will do. He set the oar, or his hand loosened on it, and he went down where he stood. There is nothing shameful in this, and no one in the story treats it as shameful. 9 days is a very long time to hold anything. The men waited a little while. Then somebody said the thing out loud. He said, "We have been rowing and starving for 10 years, and he is going home with a bag of silver, and we are going home with nothing." Somebody else agreed. Then somebody else. It is worth being fair to them here. They were not thieves by nature. They were tired men at the end of a very great absence, looking at their own island, thinking about walking up to their own doors with empty hands. That is all it was, not greed exactly, something closer to embarrassment. They untied the silver wire slowly in the dark. The bag opened, and every wrong wind in the world came out of it at once. We are not going to dwell on what followed because it is loud, and because tonight is not for loud things. It is enough to say that the wind took them, and the island went away behind them, and by morning it was gone from the horizon entirely. The captain woke up in the middle of it. That is the moment worth sitting with, not the storm, the waking. He had been asleep for perhaps an hour after 9 days. He came up out of it the way you do when something is wrong, all at once, and the first thing he understood was the motion of the ship, and the second thing he understood was the direction of the wind. He looked for the island. It was already going, slowly, the way islands go. The old accounts say he thought for a moment about going over the side. Then they say he did not. They say he pulled his cloak over his head and lay down in the bottom of the boat and stayed there. That is a very honest detail for an old story to keep. He did not shout. He did not blame anyone that night. He covered his face and lay in the bilge and let it happen. Sometimes that is all there is to do. The men said nothing. They were busy, and then they were frightened. And then, when the worst of it had passed, they were quiet in a way that lasted for days. Nobody mentioned the bag again for a long stretch. It was not a thing anyone wanted to name. Later, much later, they came back to the same floating island, and the king of the winds sent them away, because a man who loses a gift like that twice is not a man you help. And after that, they rowed. There was no wind at all for a considerable stretch, and they rowed in the flat heat for days back over the water they had crossed in 9 days of ease. That is the part nobody tells. It is not in the songs. The rowing back over it. You can imagine those days. The same sea going the wrong way at the speed of arms instead of the speed of wind. The same benches, nobody talking much. They did not fall apart. That is the thing about crews. They kept the watches. They ate their bread. They shipped the oars at dusk and lay down between the benches and got up and rowed again. The captain took the oar in turns like everyone else after that. He had learned something, though he would not have put it into words. Here is what it might have been. There was, on that ship, an older man who had been silent through the whole business, and it is said he spoke to the captain once about it, some nights afterwards, when it was dark and the water was flat. He said, "You carried it alone, and that is why it opened." The captain did not answer him, but he turned it over slowly, for years. That is the small, quiet lesson under a very large, loud story. A thing kept secret and guarded and carried by one pair of hands will find its way open eventually. Not through malice, through curiosity and tiredness and 9 days of wondering. The bag was quiet. It did not need to be watched so closely. It only needed to be explained. And it never was on a fair wind within sight of home a very long time ago. Let us wander somewhere else now. Consider now a different room on an island in the middle of nowhere, with a fire in it that never seemed to go out. The men stayed there a year. That is the fact that gets lost. Every telling rushes through the strange part at the beginning. Then it says, almost in passing, that they remained there for a full turning of the seasons. A year of ordinary days. A year of evenings. Tonight, we are going to spend one of those evenings there, near the end. The hall was large and it was warm. Picture it. Stone walls with woven cloth hung over them. That is what people did before there was any other way to keep a room warm. Extended tables of old wood, worn pale, in the middle where hands had been. A hearth at one end, big enough to stand in. The fire in it was fed all day. That was somebody's whole work. There were lamps, small clay lamps with a wick floating in oil. They sat along the tables and in niches in the wall. They burn with a low, steady flame. They smell faintly of olives. It is not a bright light. It is the softest light there has ever been. Nothing in that room was bright. That is worth saying. Every light in it was the color of butter. The men ate at those tables every night for a year. Think about what that meant to them. They had eaten hard bread on a wet bench for years. Now there was roast meat and soft bread and figs and wine that was not mostly water. They put on weight. Their hands healed. The salt cracks in their palms closed up and did not come back. That is what a year does. By the end of it, they had settled into a kind of household. Somebody had taken charge of the fire. Somebody had taken charge of the animals. There was a man who had been a rower for 10 years. He spent his days mending fences on the hillside. Now, he was good at it and quietly proud of the work. There was a man who had learned to make cheese from one of the women of the house. These are the things that happen when people stop moving. They begin to make small arrangements. It takes about a month. There is something worth saying about what a year of good food does to a body that has been living hard. The first change is sleep. Men who have been sleeping on wet boards for years sleep enormously when they are finally warm. 14 hours, some of them for the first weeks. The second change is the hands. Rowing hands are a specific thing. The palms build up a rind, and the rind cracks in salt water, and the cracks never quite close while you are still rowing. Ashore, they close. It takes about a month. The third change is slower and stranger. People begin to have opinions again about small things. What they would like for dinner, whether the fire is smoking, which corner of the hall they prefer. A man with nothing has no preferences. A man with a warm room develops them within weeks. They are the first sign that he has stopped surviving and started living somewhere. Nobody on that island noticed it happening. That is how it always goes. The evenings were long and slow. After the meal, the tables were cleared, and the men sat on. They played at knucklebones. They talked. Some of them slept where they were, on the benches, with their heads on their arms. The fire settled. The lamps burned down and were topped up from a jug. Someone would usually sing, not performance, exactly. Just a man singing something from home, half remembered, to nobody in particular, while other people carried on their conversations. This is what a hall sounded like at night for most of human history. A low general murmur, a fire, and somebody singing badly in the corner. The captain sat apart, most evenings near the hearth. He had been sitting there a great many nights by then, and the men had noticed and had stopped remarking on it. He was not unhappy. It was not a hard year. This is the part that is difficult to hold in the mind. That year was not a punishment. He had a warm room and enough food. He had a woman of great power who was kind to him. She did not ask him to be anything in particular. He simply stopped counting the days at some point. That is, the whole event. There was no moment of decision. He put down the counting, the way you put down a cup, and then a season went by, and then another. It is said that it was the men who woke him. One evening near the end of the year, a few of them came over to where he sat. They did not make a speech. One of them, an older man, simply said that they had been talking and that they wondered whether he still meant to go home. He said, of course he did. They said nothing to that. They stood there for a moment, and then they went back to the tables. That was all. That was the whole intervention, and it was enough, because the question had been asked out loud in a room where it had not been asked for a very far season. He sat with it for the rest of that evening. He looked at the fire, he looked at the tables, and the men at them, fatter and healthier and calmer than they had been in 10 years. He looked at the woven cloth on the walls, which he could now describe with his eyes shut. He thought about the shape of his own hands, which had gone soft. There is a thing that happens to people who are in the middle of a long journey and stop somewhere pleasant. The stopping does not feel like stopping. It is not idleness. It feels like resting. And resting is a thing that has an end, so you do not have to defend it. And so you never quite notice when it stops being resting and becomes where you live. A year is a wide rest. He did not blame himself for it. That is worth saying too, because he was a man who blamed himself for most things. But he seems to have understood that a body that has been at sea for 10 years will take what it is given. He went out of the hall late that night. Outside, there was a courtyard, and beyond it, the hillside going down to the water, gray in the dark, and the sea beyond that. The sea was very quiet. It usually was around that island. He stood and looked at it for a while. It had not changed at all in a year. That is the thing about the sea. It waits without any impatience whatsoever. It will wait as long as you like. It does not care whether you ever come back to it. He went in and slept. In the morning, he began slowly to speak about the ship. It took some weeks to get the ship ready again. The hull had to be scraped and pitched. The ropes had to be replaced, most of them, because rope that has lain a year on a beach is not rope you want in weather. This was not quick work. The men worked on it without complaining, though some of them were slower about it than others. The man who had learned to make cheese took a slow while over his last few days. On the last night, there was a meal in the hall like all the others. The fire was built up. The lamps were filled. Somebody sang badly in the corner. Nothing about it was different, and everybody knew it was the last one, and nobody said so. That is how it usually goes with last nights. They are not marked. They look exactly like the ordinary ones. That is what makes them worth noticing afterwards. They went down to the ship in the morning. The hall stayed behind them on its hill, with its fire and its butter-colored light and its year of quiet evenings, and it is the only place in that whole long journey that anyone might reasonably have wanted to stay. The rest was quiet. It did not need to be defended. It only needed to end, eventually, and it did, after a year of great evenings on an island in the middle of nowhere. Time moved on, slowly, as it always does, and somewhere else, at the far edge of the water, there was a stranger kind of night. There is another corner of the past that holds the same quiet. It lies at the far end of the water, where the sailors said the sun did not properly rise. They came to a shore of gray sand under a sky that never fully cleared. It is said that there was a country at the edge of the ocean where the light was always like the light before dawn. It is not dark, it is not day. A long gray evening that did not move on. That is how the old accounts describe it, and it is a very good description of a place that probably never existed. There is no comfort in a light like that. The men did not like it. Sailors are superstitious about light, and this light was wrong. They put the ship in and drew it up on the gray sand, and they stood there for a while, and nobody wanted to go inland. There is a grove near that shore, black poplars and willows that had lost their leaves, and no birds in any of them. Beyond the grove, there was a low place where two rivers came together, and that was where they were told to go. The captain went. He took 2 men with him. Tonight, we are not going to talk about what he came there to do. In the old telling, there is an animal in it, and there are words said over a trench. None of that belongs to a night like this one. We are going to talk about who came and what was said, because the whole of it is really a very considerable, very quiet conversation. Something about what people of that age actually thought happened afterwards, since we are standing at the edge of it. It was not a place of punishment. That idea came much later. This was simply where everybody went, kings and rowers alike, and nothing much occurred there. The old accounts describe it as gray and dim and populated. The people in it are diminished rather than tormented. They are described as being like smoke or like a dream, and they are always spoken of as tired. That is a bleak picture in one way. In another, it is oddly gentle. Nobody is being singled out. Nobody is being examined. It is the same for everyone, and it is quiet. And the only thing anyone there seems to want is news from the house they left. They came slowly. That is the thing everyone remembers about that story. They did not rush. They came up out of the gray, one at a period, and they stood a little way off, and they waited to be spoken to. There were a great many of them, old sailors, women who had gone in childbirth, men who had been kings once and no longer looked like it, young men who had gone before they had learned anything much. They were not frightening. They are not what you would expect. They were sad, and they were patient, and above all, they were quiet. the captain sat down. The first one who came near was a young man from his own crew. A boy, really. He had gone on the island of the hall with the butter-colored lamps. It was a stupid, ordinary thing, a fall from a roof in the night. They had left in the morning without noticing. That is the detail that hurts, and it is worth saying gently. They had sailed away without him, and no one had counted, and he had lain there unburied while they went about their work. He did not accuse anyone. He asked, very simply, to be buried and to have his oar set up over the grave. That is all he wanted, an oar in the ground, so that somebody passing would know a rower had been there. The captain promised him. Then his mother came. He had not known she was gone. He had left her alive on his island a great many years before, and he had thought of her that way ever since, in the house, in the courtyard, going about her day. She had gone of waiting. That is more or less what she told him. Not of illness, not of anything you could name. She had simply grown old with her eyes on the water. He tried to hold her. It did not work. He tried 3 times. Each time his arms went through her, the way they go through smoke, and each spell he stood there with his hands empty. She explained it to him, patiently, the way a mother explains a thing to a child who is not going to like the answer. She said that this is what happens. She said, the body goes. What is left is like a dream. It cannot be held, and it was not meant to be. She did not speak of it for long. Then she asked about his father. She asked about his wife. She asked about his son, whom she had known as a baby. That is what she wanted to talk about, not her own going, the household. He told her what he could. It was not much. He had been away as extended as the boy had been alive. She listened. She did not interrupt him. She said his wife was still in the house. She said his father had gone out to the country and slept on the ground among the vines now, and would not come into town. Then she said, the thing that he carried afterwards. She said, go on, and take note of everything, so that you can tell her about it later. It is not a warning. It is not a prophecy. It is an errand, the most ordinary sentence a mother has ever said to a son who is going out. She did not stay long. She went back into the gray. Others came after her, a great many, all night. He talked to old comrades. He talked to men he had thought were still alive. He listened more than he spoke. There was no hurry in any of it. There was nothing hurried about any of it. This is not a place that hurries. Nobody there had anywhere to be. That is the one advantage of that country, if it can be called an advantage. There is no shortage of time in it at all. At some point, he stopped answering. There were simply too many, and they kept coming up out of the low ground, quietly, wanting to be spoken to, and he found that he could not do it anymore. He went back through the poplars to the shore. The 2 men who had come with him had not gone far. They were sitting on the sand with their backs to the trees, not looking at anything, and they got up when they saw him. And none of the three of them said a word about it. The ship was where they had left it. It had not moved. The men aboard had slept badly and were glad to be doing something. They pushed off into that gray water. They rowed until the shore was gone. There is not much else to say about it. Nobody talked for a far while. Then, gradually, over some hours, they began to talk about ordinary things again, which is what people do. Here is what is worth taking from that shore tonight. Every single one of those figures wanted the same thing, and it was a small thing. They wanted to be remembered by name. They wanted an oar set up over a grave. They wanted to hear how the household was getting on. None of them asked for anything large. It is not a frightening thing to hear. That is a quiet fact underneath a story that people usually find frightening. The dead in that account are not angry. They are not waiting to punish anybody. They are only interested in the people they left, and they will wait a very long while to hear about them. The boy got his grave later and his oar over it. That is recorded, and it is one of the few promises in the whole wide journey that was kept exactly. The talking was quiet. It did not need to be answered. It only needed to be listened to patiently on a gray shore at the end of the water, a very long time ago. Let us wander somewhere else now. Consider now a different stretch of water, flat and bright, and entirely without wind. The thing that everyone remembers about this part is the singing. What almost nobody mentions is the wax. We are going to spend tonight on the wax. It happened, if it happened, on a morning of dead calm. But the preparation was done the night before, and that is where we are going. The ship lay at anchor off a small headland. The sea was so flat that the reflection of the mast stood in it, still and unbroken, for hours. The water was still in a way that water rarely is. There is a particular stillness to it. Sailors do not entirely trust it, but it is very beautiful, and it is very quiet, and on that evening it meant there was nothing at all to do. The men sat on the benches with a lump of beeswax. Here is the work. Beeswax comes hard. It has to be softened before it will do anything, and the way to soften it is with your hands. So you take a piece about the size of a walnut and you begin. You press it with your thumbs. You fold it over. You press it again. At first it resists completely. It is not soft at all. It feels like pressing a stone and nothing happens. Then, after a few minutes, it begins to give. It goes waxy at the edges first. It takes the print of your thumb. It starts to smell faintly of honey, which is the smell of the hive it came from, and which stays in beeswax for years. You keep working it. You warm it against your palm. You roll it between your hands. After a while, it is soft all the way through, and it will take any shape you want. That is the whole of it. That is the great preparation for the most famous danger in the story. A boat full of grown men sitting quietly in the evening light, kneading wax with their thumbs. It takes a slow stretch. It is not quick work. That is the point. There is no way to hurry beeswax. Something about beeswax, since we are spending the evening on it. It comes from the comb, and the comb is built by bees a small piece at a time, and it takes a great deal of honey eaten to make a very little wax. People used it for everything: sealing jars, waterproofing thread, writing tablets where a thin layer of it over wood took the mark of a stylus and could be smoothed flat again with a warm thumb. That last one is worth pausing on. For a long stretch of history, the ordinary way to write a note was to press it into wax and then rub it out. The wax on that boat may well have come from a tablet or a jar or a hive somebody kept on a hillside 100 miles away. It smelled of honey either way. It always does. They did it as the light went. The captain went along the benches with the lump, breaking off a piece for each man, and each man began to work his own. Nobody talked much. It is not a task that invites conversation. There is something about work with the hands that makes people quiet, and this was the slowest handwork there is. You could hear the sea against the hull. You could hear somebody breathing through his nose while he concentrated. That was all. The captain explained what would happen briefly and then did not explain it again. He said there would be singing in the morning from an island they would pass. He said it would be the best thing any of them had ever heard. He said that men who listened to it went towards it and did not come back, and that was all he was going to say about that. He said, "Your ears will be closed. You will hear nothing. Row until the island is behind us." The men accepted this without much discussion. Crews do. When you have been at sea 10 years, you develop an enormous tolerance for strange instructions. Then he told them the other part. He said that he himself was not going to have wax in his ears. He said he wanted to hear it. He said they were to tie him to the mast, and that if he asked to be untied, they were to tie him tighter. That is the part everyone knows. It sounds like courage. Sitting on the boat that evening, it probably sounded like something else. One of the men is said to have asked why. The old accounts do not record an answer. Here is a possible one, and it is only a guess, offered gently. He had been going home for a very great season by then, and he had lost a great deal, and there was going to be exactly one chance in his life to hear the most beautiful sound in the world. He did not want to arrive home having missed it. That is not heroism. It is not bravery either. That is closer to the feeling you get at the end of a long trip, when you go out of your way to see one more thing, because you know you are not coming back. The rope was got out and looked over that night. That is a real detail worth pausing on. Somebody checked the rope. Somebody laid it ready by the mast, coiled, so that in the morning there would be no fumbling. The wax was set aside in little balls, one per man, and each man knew which was his because he had made it. Then it was dark, and there was nothing more to prepare. They ate, they lay down between the benches. The water stayed still all night. The ship hardly moved at all. The captain lay awake a while, as he usually did. He was thinking about the morning, presumably, though what he was thinking is not recorded. Perhaps he was afraid. Perhaps he was looking forward to it. Both are likely, and they are not opposites. In the morning the calm held. They put the wax in. This is a small, strange moment. A boat full of men, each putting his own soft, warm wax into his own ears, one at a time, and the world going quiet in stages. Sound does not vanish with wax. It is not silence. It goes distant and dull. You can still hear your own heartbeat and your own breathing very loudly, because those come through the bone. So each of them ended up inside himself, hearing mostly his own body, watching everyone else do the same. Then they tied him to the mast. Then they rowed. There was nothing else to do. We are not going to describe what he heard. It is not written down anywhere. Every account of that story is careful to tell you that the singing was beyond description, and then does not describe it, which is a very old and very effective trick. The men saw him strain against the rope. They saw his face. They tightened the knots, as instructed, and went on rowing, hearing nothing but their own breath and the wooden knock of the oars in the pins. It went on for some period. Then the island fell behind, and the water changed, and one of them took his wax out and heard the ordinary sea again. The sea was still again. They untied him. He did not say anything about it, not that day, and, as far as anyone recorded, not for a considerable time afterwards. That is what stays with me about this story. The most beautiful sound in the world came and went, and the men who were there did not hear it, and the one who did could not tell anybody. They dug the wax out of their ears and threw it over the side. Then they ate some bread and shipped their oars. When the light went, and lay down between the benches like every other night. The work was quiet. It did not need to be heard. It only needed to be finished, slowly, with the hands, on a flat sea in the last of the evening light, a very long spell ago. Let us wander somewhere else now. Far from there, and extended after, there was a man sitting on a rock, looking at water for 7 years. That is the whole scene. There is nothing else in it. Of all the places in this long story, this is the one where the least happens, and it is the one worth the most of our time tonight. The island was small, and it was beautiful. Picture it, a cave in the side of a hill, with a wide mouth facing the sea, vines growing across the opening, heavy with fruit, 4 springs of clear water running out of the rock nearby, in 4 directions, through soft grass. Around the cave, a wood of alder and poplar and cypress, birds in it, owls at night, and sea crows, and small birds that had never been hunted and were not afraid of anyone. Inside the cave, there was a fire that smelled of cedar. There was weaving on a loom. There was a bed. The old accounts say that even a passing god would have stopped and looked at that place and been pleased. It was, by every description, perfect. He sat on the shore every day. That is the record. He would get up and eat and then go down to a particular rock at the edge of the water and sit on it and look east and stay there most of the day. 7 years of this. We should be careful here because this is the one place in the story where a modern listener may recognize something in himself, and it is worth handling gently. He was not being tortured. Nobody was unkind to him. He was fed. He was warm. He was loved in a fashion by someone who wanted him to stay and offered him a life without ending and without aging. He simply could not stop looking east. There is no lesson in this. It is not a moral failing, and it is not a virtue either. It is only a fact about him and about a certain kind of person. He could not enjoy a thing that was not his. The days there were very quiet. The sea on that side of the island came in slowly, small and steady. The springs ran all the while, 4 of them, with that sound, running water, makes that you stop hearing after a week and then start hearing again on certain evenings. The wood was full of birds. They were still and unbothered, and they were not disturbed by him. He would have known that rock extremely well by the end. Which part of it held the heat of the afternoon, where the barnacles were? Which way the water came round it on a rising tide? The water was still there most mornings. 7 years is far enough to learn a rock completely. It is worth describing the 4 springs. They are the detail the old account lingers on, and lingering is what we are here for. They came out of the rock close together and then went 4 different ways through the meadow. Clear water over small stones, cress growing at the edges, violets in the soft ground. Water like that makes a sound all day and all night without ever repeating itself exactly. It is the same sound now in whatever hills are nearest to you, doing the same thing. He would have crossed those streams every day going down to his rock. He stepped over the same stones. After 7 years, his feet would have known them without looking. That is what happens to a path you walk daily. It stops being distance. It becomes something your body does while your mind is elsewhere. His mind was elsewhere for 7 years. In the evenings, he went back up to the cave. They ate together. She had food that was not the food of people, and there was food set aside for him, ordinary bread and meat and wine, and they sat across from each other and ate their different meals. They talked. It is recorded that she was good company, and that he was too, and that a great many of those evenings were pleasant. Then the fire went down slowly, and the cave went dark, and the night was very long. He did not sleep well there. That is also recorded in a small way, and it is the detail that makes the whole thing true to me. A man with nothing to do and nowhere to be, in a warm cave on a beautiful island, lying awake. Anyone who has been unhappy in a nice place will know exactly what that is. In the morning, he went back down to the rock. Now, something worth saying, kindly, about 7 years. They did not feel like 7 years to him. They cannot have. Time in a place where nothing changes does not pile up the way it does elsewhere. There were no seasons worth speaking of on that island. No harvests, no festivals, nothing to count by. So the years went through him slowly, without leaving marks, and he could not have told you, at the end, whether it had been 3 or 10. That is what a place without events does. It is not that stretch passes quickly. It is that it does not pass at all, and then you look up and it has. She asked him once why he wanted to go. This is the conversation the story is really about, and it is very short. She pointed out, reasonably, that his wife was an ordinary woman who would grow old. She pointed out that she herself would not. She offered him a life without ending. And he answered her carefully, because he did not want to be unkind. He said he knew all that. He said his wife was ordinary and would grow old and was in every way the lesser thing to look at. Then he said he wanted to go home anyway. That was all. He had no better argument than that, and he did not pretend to. She let him go, eventually. Not because he persuaded her, because word came from elsewhere that he was to be let go, and she was angry about it. And then she was sad about it, and then she helped him. That is worth saying too. She helped him. She showed him where the trees were that would make good timber. She gave him tools. She brought him cloth for a sail and made it up herself. She gave him bread and water and wine for the crossing, and told him which stars to steer by. She did all of it properly and well. He worked slowly. It took him a few days to build the raft, and she watched him do it, and she did not sulk about it. On the last evening, they ate together in the cave, as they had for 7 years, and it is written that the meal was as much like all the others. Then in the morning he pushed off. He sat at the steering oar with the star she had told him about off his left shoulder, and the island went small behind him, slowly, and then blue, and then it was gone. He never spoke about her much afterwards. Here is the thing to take away from that island, if you take anything at all. 7 years is a very wide time to sit on a rock. It sounds like a waste, and in a way it was. But a man who sits and looks in one direction for 7 years is not idle. He is holding on to something with his whole strength, quietly, without any encouragement whatsoever, and with no evidence that it will do him any good. That is a kind of work, too. Nobody sees it. Nobody thanks anyone for it. He did it anyway, every day, sitting still on the same rock, facing east, in the most beautiful place he ever saw. the waiting was quiet. It did not need to be understood. It only needed to go on. And it did. Morning after morning, for 7 years, on a small green island a very long way from anywhere. Let us wander somewhere else now. There is another corner of the past that holds the same quiet. It is a small square of timber on a very large sea with one man on it. He built it himself over a few days on the shore of the island with the 4 springs. That is worth describing slowly because it is one of the few pieces of practical work in this whole story that is set down step by step in the old accounts, as if somebody wanted us to be able to do it. He cut 20 trees, alder and poplar and pine, standing dry, which is the timber that floats best. He trimmed them, he squared them with an axe. It is slow work. It leaves a surface that is flat enough, and not more than that. He bored holes and fitted the beams together with pegs. He laid a deck across the top. He put up a mast and a yard for the sail and a steering oar at the back. He built a low fence of woven willow along the sides. It kept the water off. He weighted the whole thing with brushwood and ballast, so it would sit steady. Then he made the sail from the cloth she had given him, with ropes at the corners. It took 4 days. On the 5th, he put it in the water. That is a whole vessel, made alone, with hand tools. He was not a shipwright. It took less than a week. It is the most competent thing he does in the entire story, and nobody ever talks about it. Then he sailed for 17 days. 17 days alone on a raft. That is the part we are here for. Think about what that is. A flat square of wood, low to the water. The sea is right there beside you, at the level of your knees. No hull to be inside. No shelter. Nowhere to stand except on the deck. He sat at the steering oar. He did not sleep. That is the extraordinary detail. For 17 days he held the oar and watched the stars, and the old accounts say plainly that sleep never fell on his eyelids. That is probably not literally true, but something close to it must have been. A raft with a sail cannot be left alone for slow. There was nobody else aboard. So, 17 days of sitting in the open, holding an oar. She had told him which stars to use, and this is the part I find most beautiful in the whole long journey. She told him to keep the bear on his left hand. That is the whole instruction. There is a group of stars in the north that goes round and round. It never sets. Keep it on your left, and you are going east. That is all the navigation there was. One group of stars on one side for 17 days. He watched them all night, every night. You would come to know that sky extremely well. Which ones rise first? Which one comes up just before the light? How the whole wheel turns slowly over a night. It is not something you can see happening, but look away and look back an hour later, and everything has moved. There is nothing in the world quite as calm as that turning. It has been doing it for a very great season. It was doing it before anyone was here to watch. something about the raft itself, since he built it, and we have the recipe. 20 trees is a great deal of timber for one man to fell alone. The old account says he worked with an axe of bronze and an adze. She brought him an auger for the holes. An auger is a hand drill. You turn it with both palms, leaning your weight on it. It takes a long time to go through a beam of green wood. There would have been many holes. The pegs and the lashings did the rest. Nothing was nailed. There was no nail in that whole vessel. A raft built that way flexes with the sea instead of fighting it. It is slow, and it is wet, and it will not sail close to the wind at all. But it holds together in a swell far better than something rigid. He would have known that. Any sailor of that age would have known it. The days were emptier than the nights. The sun on open water is heavy, and there is no shade anywhere on a raft. He would have rigged something with the sail for the middle hours. He had bread and water and wine. He made them last. The sea went past, or rather it did not go past. A raft moves at the speed of a slow walk. The sea does not appear to move at all. Nothing changed for days at a period. There was not much to look at. Occasionally there were birds. That is worth mentioning. To a man alone on the water, a bird is an event, something with an opinion, going somewhere for a reason. Occasionally, a fish came up alongside and stayed with the raft for a while, in the shadow of it, the way fish do. Mostly there was nothing. It is not an empty feeling. Here is something about being alone for a considerable time that people who have done it will recognize. The mind goes through stages. First, it is busy. It thinks about everything it has been putting off. That lasts a few days. Then it goes quiet. Then, somewhere after that, it becomes very simple, and it is mostly occupied with the immediate things: the rope, the oar, the water, the light, the stars. It is not busy anymore. It stops making plans. It stops rehearsing arguments. By the second week, he would have been in that state, sitting, holding, watching, entirely without complication. It is one of the few kinds of rest a person can get while working. One more thing about that sky, since he had 17 nights under it. The group of stars she named for him never sets in that part of the world. It circles the pole and stays up all year, every night, and it has been doing that since well before anybody was watching. Sailors everywhere found it independently. It is one of the very few pieces of knowledge that every seafaring people worked out on their own. That is a comforting thought to lie under. Whatever else was uncertain out there, the north stayed where it was. He kept it on his left and went east. On the 18th day he saw land, hills, low on the horizon, like a shield lying on the water. That is the phrase in the old account, and it is a good one. He did not reach it that day. It took a while yet. There was weather in it. The raft came apart eventually. But we are not going there tonight. Tonight, We are staying out on the flat blue in the middle of the 17 days where nothing at all was happening. There is a version of this story that is about endurance. That version is fine. It is not the one worth listening to at night. Here is the other one. For 17 days, he had nothing to decide. He had one job, which was to keep a group of stars on his left hand. Everything else in the Grotos world was somebody else's problem, and it was all somewhere over the horizon. After 10 years of being responsible for other men, he was responsible for a raft. I do not think he was unhappy out there. The sky turned over him slowly, night after night, exactly as it had over every sailor before him, and exactly as it does now over whatever is above you tonight. The stars were quiet. They did not need to be steered by. They only needed to go on turning. And they did, all night, every night, over a small square of timber, a very long way from anywhere. Spell moved on, slowly, as it always does, and somewhere ahead, on a stony island, a house was still standing. Consider now a small building on a hillside, made of stone, with a fire in the middle of the floor and rain coming down outside. There is a room in this story that nobody talks about. This is not a famous place. It is the one worth sitting in tonight. The man who lived there kept pigs. He had kept them for a very extended time. He had built the yard himself. Out of stones he had carried up the hill. He topped the wall with thorn. Inside the yard, there were pens for the sows. The boars slept outside. It was not a small farm. That is a working farm, run properly, by one man with 3 or 4 helpers. He had built the hut, too. He had set the roof beams himself and cut the thatch. He was not young anymore. He had come to that island as a child from somewhere else. He had worked there ever since. Everything he owned fitted in a corner of the room. He was making himself a pair of sandals when the stranger came. That is the detail the old accounts keep, and it is a perfect one. Cutting an ox hide to shape on an evening, sitting by the fire. The stranger was an old man in bad clothes. There is nothing impressive about him. It is not the arrival anyone remembers. He had a stick and a bag and no shoes worth mentioning. He came up the path in the last of the light. The dogs went for him as farm dogs do. The swineherd came out and shouted at them. He threw stones. He got the man inside and apologized for the dogs. He said a guest should not be met that way. That is the first thing he does. This is not a small thing. He apologizes to a beggar about his dogs. Then he sat him down. Here is what he did next. It is worth going through slowly. This is one of the oldest descriptions of hospitality that we have. There is not a single grand gesture in it. He spread brushwood on the bench. Then he laid a goatskin over it. The stranger would not sit on bare wood. It was his own bedding. It was not a spare. He used it as a mattress, and he gave it away for the evening without mentioning that. He went out and took 2 young pigs from the pens. That is what you do for a guest. He was not a rich man. It cost him something. He cooked them. He did it carefully with the meat on spits, and he sprinkled it with barley meal. He gave the guest the best portion, the chine, the long cut along the back. That was the honored piece. He put it in front of him without any ceremony at all. He mixed the wine himself in an ivywood bowl and sat down opposite. Then he said, "Eat. There is nothing more to the ceremony than that." That is the whole ritual, and it happened in every household in that world. Every while, somebody came to the door. It happened because everyone believed the person at the door might be anyone. A word about that room. Rooms like it are where most of the human race spent most of its evenings for a very far time. One room, a fire in the middle of the floor, on bare stone or beaten earth. No chimney. The smoke goes up and finds its way out through the thatch slowly, over hours. On the way it dries and darkens everything under the roof. That is why the beams in old houses are black. It is decades of smoke going gently through them. The light comes from the fire and nothing else. It is orange, and it moves, so nothing in the room is ever quite still. You sit low, because heat sits low. You sleep near the fire in winter and away from it in summer. You keep your good cloak for weather and your bad one for the house. There is nothing romantic about a room like that. It is smoky and it is cramped, but it is warm. On a wet night, on a hillside, warm is the whole of what anybody wants. They talked for hours. It was not a hurried conversation. The rain came on outside. That is recorded too. It was a filthy night, wet and blowing, and the fire was the only light in the room. The swineherd talked about his master, who had gone away to the fighting a great many years before, and who had not come back, and who he still believed was alive. He said it plainly. He said the man was gone. He said the house was being eaten through by strangers. His mistress waited and would not choose. The son had grown up with nobody to show him anything. He said he did not expect to see his master again. Then he said in the next breath that he would not believe he was gone. Both things at once. It does not have to make sense. That is how waiting actually works. The stranger listened. He was very still. You know who the stranger was. The swineherd did not. That is the whole shape of the scene, and the old accounts do not milk it at all. They simply let two men sit by a fire on a wet night and talk. At some point, the stranger said that his master would come home. He said it would be soon, and he offered to swear to it. The swineherd told him not to bother. You do not have to promise a man anything to be fed here. He said, gently enough, that beggars often said that sort of thing for a cloak and a meal. He said he would rather they did not. He said he would feed him anyway. That is the moment I would keep from the entire journey, if I could keep only one. Later they lay down. The younger men came in from the fields with the pigs and shut them up for the night. There was a great deal of grunting from the pens outside. It is a sound that goes on for a while and then settles. The fire was banked. The rain kept on. The room went quiet. The swineherd made up a bed for the stranger near the fire, out of skins. He put his own thick cloak over him. It was the one he kept for bad weather. Then he took a spear and a heavy cloak of his own. He went outside to sleep with the pigs, under a hollow rock, out of the wind. That is the last thing in the scene. He gave a beggar his bed and his blanket, and went out into the rain to sleep beside his animals, because they were his responsibility, and it was a bad night. Nobody was watching. It was not done to be seen. Nobody would ever have known. The stranger lay by the fire and did not sleep for a while. He had been away a very long stretch. He had been in halls with butter-colored lamps. He had been on islands where nobody grew old. He had been offered a life without ending by someone who meant it. Now he was lying on a pile of skins in a hut that smelled of pigs, listening to rain. It was the first time in 20 years that anyone had given him something without knowing who he was. He was home. It is not the homecoming anyone pictures, not in his house, but on the island, in the wind, under a roof somebody had thatched by hand. The fire went down to red. The rain kept on. The pigs settled, and the yard was still. The kindness was quiet. It did not need a name to be given. It only needed somebody at the door, on a bad night, on a hillside farm a very wide season ago. Let us wander somewhere else now. There is another corner of that island worth visiting. It lies inland, up in the hills, where an old man had gone to live among his trees. He had been a king once. It is not what he did anymore. When his son had gone away to the fighting, he had stayed in the house for a while. Then, at some point that nobody recorded, he had stopped staying in it. He went out to the country. He built himself a small place there, near the vines, and he lived in it with a few farm people who looked after him, and he worked the ground with his hands. He wore a patched tunic that he had stitched himself badly. He wore leather leggings against the thorns and a goatskin cap. He looked exactly like any other old man on any other hillside. That is worth sitting with. The father of the most famous traveler in the world spent 20 years pruning trees in bad clothes. The orchard was on a slope. It is not a large one. There were pear trees. There were apple trees. There were figs and long rows of vines, and each row ripened at a different time, so that there was always something coming in. He had planted most of them himself, years before, when his son was a boy. That is the detail the old accounts keep, and it is the one that matters tonight. The boy had followed him around this orchard once, asking for things, and the old man had given him trees. 13 pear trees, 10 apple trees, 40 fig trees, rows of vines, promised one by one to a child who wanted to own something. He remembered which ones. It does not sound possible, all of them. 20 years later, he could still walk the rows and say which tree had been given away. The work in an orchard is slow and it never finishes. In the winter, there is pruning. You cut back the wood that fruited last year because it will not fruit again, and you leave the young wood. And you do this tree by tree with a small blade on cold mornings for weeks. In the spring, there is digging around the roots and clearing and watching for frost. In the summer, there is water, carrying it mostly in a place like that. In the autumn, there is the fruit, which comes all at once and has to be dealt with immediately. Then it is winter again, and you prune. It does not finish. He did this for 20 years without expecting anything. That is the part worth understanding. A man who plants an orchard is making an arrangement with the future. But an old man pruning trees whose owner has not come home is doing something stranger than that. He is keeping a promise to somebody who may not exist anymore. He did not talk about it much. The hillside was quiet, and so was he. The people on the farm said he had grown very quiet over the years. He worked. It is not a complicated life. He ate very little. He slept badly in the winters on a bed of leaves near the fire. In the summers, he slept outside, in the dirt among the vines, because he liked it there better. That is recorded plainly, and there is something in it that is hard to say out loud. He preferred to be outside among the things he had planted than inside a house that reminded him. Something about olives, since the old man spent 20 years among them. An olive tree is not in a hurry, planted from a cutting. It will give you a little fruit in 5 or 6 years. A proper crop comes when it is a good deal older than that. Then it goes on. 200 years is ordinary for an olive. Some of them live a great deal longer. They get hollow in the middle and keep going anyway, throwing new wood from the old base. The wood is hard and dense, and it does not rot easily. That is why doors and bedposts and handles were made from it. A man planting an olive is doing something for people he will not meet. Everybody who has ever planted one knows that. They do it anyway, and they do not think it is a sacrifice. The trees in that orchard would have outlived every single person in this story. The evenings up there were slow. The hills of that island go blue at dusk and then gray. There is very little on them. Stone, thorn, thin grass. There are goats somewhere out of sight with their bells. It is very quiet up there. Below, a long way down, the sea. It goes silver and then dark, and then it disappears entirely, and you only know it is there because there is nothing else it could be. He would sit outside his hut still, with his hands sore from the day. An orchard makes a particular kind of hand. The nails split, the palms hard, small cuts everywhere from thorns and pruning. He had those hands for 20 years, and they were not the hands he had had as a king. He did not seem to mind that either. Sometimes, one of the farm people would sit with him and they would talk about the trees. What had set well? What had blight? Whether the young vines would take on the higher terrace. That is what he wanted to talk about. Nobody ever recorded him asking for news from the harbor. He must have asked once. Everybody asks for a while. Then, at some point, there is a day when you stop asking, and it is not a decision, and you do not notice it happening. The lamp inside the hut was small. He put it out early most nights. Old men who work outside do not sit up. Then it was dark on that hillside. It was still, and there was nothing at all to see, and the goat's bells came from further off, and he lay down on his leaves. 20 years of those quiet nights. Here is what I want to leave with you about this orchard. The trees did not care why they were being pruned. They took the care, and they made fruit, year after year. And every one of those years there was fruit on trees that had been promised to a boy who was somewhere out on the water. The work held the place together. Not the house, not the household, the orchard. When his son finally came up that hill, at the very end of everything, he found the old man alone, digging around a young tree in his patched tunic with a spade. The old man did not look up straight away. He was still bent over the work. There was a plant to finish. And when he did look up, the first thing the son said, to prove who he was not about himself. He walked the rows and named the trees, 13 pears, 10 apples, 40 figs. He had remembered them too. That is the reunion. 2 men in a garden listing fruit trees, both of them crying. There is no better ending in the whole of that great story, and it happens quietly in the dirt, a long way from anybody. The work was slow. It did not need to be watched. It only needed to go on, season after season, on a hillside above the sea, for a very considerable period. Let us wander somewhere else now. Consider now a hall on an island of sailors, with a great many lamps in it, and a man sitting at a table with a cloth over his head. The people of that island were the best seamen anyone had ever heard of. Their ships were said to need no steering. They simply knew where you wanted to go. That is a lovely thing to believe about a neighboring people. It may only mean that they were very good at it. They took the stranger in without asking anything. That was their custom. A man came out of the sea with nothing. They fed him and clothed him and did not ask his name. Asking a guest his name before he has eaten was considered a rudeness. So he sat at their table for a long evening, warm in borrowed clothes. Nobody knew who he was. A word about the singer, because his job is older than almost any other. He did not read. There was nothing to read from. He carried the songs entirely in his head, and they were very extended, and he could go for hours. The way it was done was with pieces, set phrases, ready-made lines, whole scenes that could be dropped in and adjusted. A singer had thousands of them, and he assembled the song as he went, differently every time. That means no two performances were the same, and no performance was invented from nothing. It is a strange kind of memory, not the memory of a text, the memory of a way of building. Men like him carried the entire history of their people for centuries before anybody thought to write it down. And they did it in the evenings, in halls, between courses, for their supper. The hall was full. It is not a quiet kind of room. Picture that room. Bronze fittings on the walls that caught the lamplight. Long tables. A great many people eating and talking at once, in the loose way people talk when a meal has been going on for hours. Outside, a garden. Pear and pomegranate and apple and fig and vines. It is said that in that garden, the fruit never failed at any season. That is another way of saying they farmed extremely well. There were dogs under the tables. There are always dogs under the tables. Then, when the eating slowed, they brought in the singer. He was blind. That is recorded. He was led in by a steward who set a chair for him against a pillar. The steward hung his lyre on a peg above his head and showed him where it was so he could reach up and find it. Then he put a table in front of him with bread and a cup of wine so the singer could eat between songs. That is a small kindness. It is not a grand moment, but the story stops to describe it. The room went still. Everyone went quiet. That is what happened in halls when the singer sat down. He played a little first, just the strings, finding the shape of the thing. Then he sang. There is no announcement before it. He sang about the fighting at the city by the sea. That was the great subject of that age. Everybody's grandfather has a great subject, and every singer had a version. He sang about the men who had been there. He named them. He sang about a quarrel between two of them, and about the things they had said to each other. And at the table, in borrowed clothes, the stranger pulled his cloak up over his head. That is the moment. It does not look like anything from outside. He was listening to a song about himself. It was a song about the version of him that existed in other people's mouths, in halls he had never been in, sung by a man who had never seen him. He was in it. This is not a comfortable thing to hear. He was a character in it. Somebody had decided what he was like. He sat under a cloth and cried where nobody could see. The old accounts are very careful about this. They say he pulled the cloak over his head so the hosts would not see him weeping. He lifted it and wiped his eyes whenever the singing stopped, and put it back when the singing started again. He did this 3 times over the course of that evening. Nobody moved. The table stayed still. Nobody noticed except the king, who was sitting near him. He was a courteous man. He said nothing at the spell. Think about what that room felt like to him. The hall was warm and pleasant. There was music. Everyone around him was enjoying an old story about people they had never met in a far country, a far time ago. For them, it was history. It was the sort of thing you put on in the evening. It was not old to him. For him, it was last week. It was the men he had eaten with. It was the ones who had gone. That gap is one of the loneliest things in the whole journey. There is nothing frightening in it at all. It is only a man in a nice room, hearing his own life turned into entertainment. That is what happens to everything eventually. It goes into songs. It gets shorter. It gets tidier. The parts that were long and cold and boring drop out. Nobody sings about the wax. Nobody sings about the coiling of rope. Later that evening, he asked the singer for a particular song by subject, the way you would ask for one. He asked for the one about the wooden horse. He asked to hear the ending of his own wide absence, sung by a stranger, out loud, in a crowded room, while he sat there with his face wet. The singer sang it. He wept again. The king saw him again, and this while the king stopped the music. That is all he did. He did not demand an explanation. He simply said that they had had enough singing and turned the talk to something else and gave the man his evening back. The tables were cleared after a while. The lamps burned down slowly. People went off to their rooms in twos and threes, the way they do at the end of a long meal. They made him a bed under the portico, out of the wind, with rugs and purple blankets. Somebody walked him out with a torch. He lay there and looked at the roof. It is not a bad place to end a day. He was closer to home than he had been in 20 years. Those sailors would take him the rest of the way in a single night, in a ship that needed no steering, and he would sleep the whole crossing. But that was tomorrow. You do not have to think about it tonight. That night, he lay still under a stranger's roof, with a song about himself going round in his head, and the lamps going out, one by one behind him in the hall. The song was quiet by then. It did not need him in the room. It only needed somebody to sing it in some hall on some evening for a very slow time after everyone in it was gone. Let us wander somewhere else now, far from there, and long before a ship sat on a beach for a month because the wind would not change. That is the whole event. A month of wanting to leave a place and being unable to. The island was green and it had cattle on it. We are not going to talk about the cattle. That part ends badly. It belongs to a different kind of evening. Tonight, we are staying in the weeks before, when nothing was wrong yet. They came in tired. They had passed through something difficult a day or two before. They had lost men. They were in no condition to argue about where to stop. They pulled the ship up into a hollow of the shore, out of the weather. They made a camp behind it. Then the south wind came, and it did not stop. Here is the thing about a wind from the wrong direction. It is not weather in the way a storm is weather. It is simply a fact that sits on top of your life. It blows steadily, day and night. It makes a sound in the grass and in the rigging. After 3 days, you stop hearing it. They could not sail into it, so they waited. The first days were fine. They had food. They had a beach and fresh water and a fire. There is nothing unpleasant about a few days of doing nothing. Not when you have been at sea. They slept a great deal. Men who have been rowing sleep like the ground has taken them. They mended things. Everything on a ship needs mending constantly. A month ashore is an opportunity. They repitched the hull. They spliced rope. Somebody rebound the handles of the oars where the wood had gone smooth. Somebody made a fishing line out of whatever was to hand. After the first week, the food began to matter. They fished off the rocks with bent hooks. They caught what they could. It was not much. They caught birds sometimes. That is the honest texture of that month. Grown men on a beach, catching small fish with poor equipment in a strong, steady wind. The captain went inland several times. He went up to look at the weather from higher ground. He went to be alone. He did that whenever he could. There is a description of him going up into the hills, out of the wind. He found a sheltered place. He washed his hands and prayed. Then he fell asleep up there. That is recorded. He went up the hill to think, and he fell asleep in the grass, in the shelter of a rock. That is the most human line in the whole story. Down on the beach, the men waited. They talked less as the weeks went on. There is a particular quiet that comes over a group of people who have run out of new things to say to each other. It is not hostile, it is just used up. They knew all of each other's stories by then. 10 years is a very great stretch to be in a small boat with the same men. So, they sat and looked at the sea, and the wind kept on from the wrong direction, and the days went by without any marks on them. Here is what a month of that does. It is not the hardship that wears people down. They were hungry, but not desperately, and they were safe on that beach. What wore them down was that there was nothing to decide. You cannot make a plan against a wind. You cannot work harder at it. There is no version of trying that helps. So they woke each morning and looked at the grass. It was lying the same way as yesterday. That was the entire content of the day. It is worth saying what they actually ate on a beach like that. It was not much, and it was very old food. Barley, when they had it, ground rough and cooked into a kind of porridge or baked flat on a stone. Bread, twice baked hard so it would keep, softened in water or wine. Olives, dried figs, cheese if any had survived, salt fish when they could get it. Fresh fish when somebody caught one. That was the event of the day. They drank wine, always cut with water, because that is how everyone drank it. Wine mixed strong was considered the behavior of people who did not know better. It is a simple diet, and it kept them alive for years. Every element of it grows within a few days' sail of that sea. People were eating almost exactly the same food in that region for thousands of years afterwards. Somebody is probably eating it tonight. Evenings were the best part. The wind dropped a little at dusk, as it often does. They would build the fire up then and sit around it. Somebody cooked whatever had been caught. It was not much of a meal most nights. They would sit up for a while after eating. Somebody usually sang. Somebody usually complained. Somebody told a story. Everyone had heard many times. Everyone let him tell it. Then the fire went low, and they lay down where they were, on the sand, with their cloaks over them. The wind went on all night in the grass above the beach. That sound is worth staying with for a moment, because it is one of the oldest sleeping sounds there is. Wind in dry grass, steady, going on and on. There are small variations in it. They never resolve into anything. You can hear it and know that nothing is going to happen, and that the sound will still be there in the morning. They slept well on that beach, on the whole. That is what makes what came later so sad, and we are not going there tonight. Tonight, they are just sleeping on the sand, in a hollow of the shore, waiting for the wind to turn. A month is a long time, but it went past the way months do. The days were all the same. Nobody could tell them apart afterwards. Somebody, near the end, said that he had stopped believing the wind would ever change. An older man told him that it always changes. He said he had waited out longer than this, in worse places. He said the wind does not have a plan. It does not know you are here. It turns when the weather over the water turns. There is no arguing with it and no hurrying it. Then he said the useful part. He said, sleep. He said there is nothing else to do, and being awake, for it does not make it come sooner. The wind was quiet in its own way. It did not need to be fought. It only needed to be outlasted, night after night, on a green island in the middle of the sea, a very considerable season ago. Time moved on, slowly as it always does, and far to the west, on a stony island, a woman was still weaving. Consider now a room upstairs in a stone house on a stony island with one lamp in it and a woman working after everyone has gone to bed. She had been waiting 20 years by then. We have spent this whole night out on the water. This is the other half of it, and it is the half nobody sings about because it has no islands in it and nobody travels anywhere. She stayed in the house. It is not a small thing to do. The house was large, and it was full of people who were not hers. They ate her food. They sat at her tables. They wanted her to choose one of them and be done with it, and they had been waiting a long while themselves by then. She would not choose. It is not refusal, either. She simply would not answer. So she made an arrangement with them, and it is one of the most beautiful stalling tactics anyone has ever come up with. She said she was weaving a shroud. It was for her husband's father, the old man up in the orchard, who was old and would need one eventually. She said it would be shameful if he were laid out without a proper cloth. She said she would choose a husband when it was finished. Everyone accepted this. It was reasonable. It was the kind of duty nobody could argue with. Something about weaving, because it is the other half of this story, and it is the half that got left out of the songs. Cloth in that world was made entirely by hand from the fleece up. Somebody sheared it. Somebody washed it. Somebody combed it straight. And then somebody spun it into thread on a weighted spindle, turning it with the fingers hour after hour. A woman of that age spun constantly, walking, sitting, talking, waiting. It was the background task of an entire sex for thousands of years. Then the thread went onto the loom, and the weaving itself began, and that was slower still. The result was worth a great deal. Good cloth was wealth. It was given as a gift between kings, and it was counted in the inventories of houses. So when this woman sat down at a great loom in the main room, she was not doing something quaint. She was doing the most valuable, ordinary work there was. Then she set up the loom. A loom in that world stood upright, taller than a person, leaning slightly against the wall. The warp threads hang down from a beam at the top, and they are held straight by small weights of clay tied along the bottom. The weaving goes from the top down, row by row. It is very slow. A large cloth is many weeks of work, even done steadily. She worked at it every day in the main room where everyone could see her. That is important. She did it publicly. She sat at the great loom in the light and passed the thread and beat it up tight with a wooden blade, and people came and went around her, and they watched the cloth grow. It grew all day. The house was still around her. Then, at night, when the house was asleep, she took a torch and went back up to it and undid the day's work. Think about that for a moment. It is not tearing, it is not cutting, it is undoing. You would have to take out the beating first, then find the end of the weft thread. Then draw it back through the warp, one pass at a period, in reverse, gently, so as not to break anything or leave a mark. You would wind it onto a spools as you went, because you would want to use it again tomorrow. That is hours of work, careful work, done in the dark, by lamplight alone, without any sound. Then she went to bed and got up and wove the same rows again the next morning. She did this for 3 years. 3 years of making a thing and unmaking it. The same handspan of cloth, over and over, forwards in the day and backwards at night. Nobody knew. There is no witness to any of it. Here is what I keep thinking about with this story. Everyone treats it as cleverness, and it is clever, but the cleverness is the small part. The large part is the doing of it. Every night, for 1,000 nights, with no audience and no encouragement, and no way of knowing whether it was worth anything. She had no news. That is the thing to hold on to. She did not know he was alive. Nobody did. For all she knew, she was undoing that cloth for a man who had been gone for years. She did it anyway. You do not need proof to keep a promise. Picture the room at night. It is upstairs. The house below has gone quiet and still. The lamp is small, the way all lamps were, and it lights her hands and the lower part of the loom and not very much else. The clay weights hang along the bottom of the warp. When she pulls a thread out, they knock together very softly. That is the only sound in the room. Knock, pause, knock, then it is still again. Her hands would have known the work so well by the end that she could have done it half asleep, and probably did some nights. 3 years is extended enough for anything to become a routine, even this. They found out eventually. One of the women of the house told them, and they came and stood over her and made her finish it. She finished it. She had no choice at that point. And then, having lost the only thing that was holding the situation still, she thought of something else, and then something else after that, and she kept going. That is the pattern of her whole 20 years. Not one grand act of loyalty, a very long series of small delays, invented one at a time as each previous one ran out. Waiting is not passive. It does not look like work. That is what this room teaches, if it teaches anything. It looks passive from outside. From inside, it is constant work. She slept badly all those years. That is recorded plainly. She would lie awake upstairs and think, and then cry a little, and then sleep near morning. It is said that sleep was the only relief she had, and that when it came, it wiped everything away for a few hours, and that she was grateful for it. That is very close to the reason anybody puts on something like this at night. Her nights were not comfortable, but she had that loom and the work of it and the knowledge that as far as the cloth was not finished, nothing had to be decided. There is a kind of peace in that. It is not resolution, it is delay held still by hand. The cloth was quiet. It did not need to be finished. It only needed to go on being not finished, one night at a spell, upstairs in a stone house, for a very long time. Let us wander somewhere else now, one last while. There is one more room to visit tonight, and then we will let the whole thing rest. It is a bedroom. It is the oldest and most ordinary place in this entire wide story, and it is where all of it was going the whole time. Many years before any of this, when he was young and building a house, there had been an olive tree growing on the ground he wanted to build on. It was a big one. It is not a tree you cut down lightly, thick as a pillar, with the gray trunk that old olives get and long leaves. He did not cut it down. It is still standing in the story. He built the room around it. He set the walls up close on all sides and roofed it over and fitted the doors and left the tree standing inside. Then he cut the trunk off above the roots and trimmed it and smoothed it and made it into a bedpost. He worked it with a blade until it was true. He bored holes in it. He fitted the other 3 posts to it and laced the frame with leather straps. The bed had one leg that was a living tree going down into the ground under the house. That is the whole thing. That is the secret at the center of the story, and it is a piece of furniture. Nobody could move that bed. It is not furniture, exactly. It was part of the ground. You could not have carried it out of the room without cutting the floor apart. Two people knew this. Him, because he had made it. Her, because she had slept in it. A word about the woodwork, because the whole story hangs on it. Olive wood is dense and it is hard on tools. It does not split cleanly along a grain because the grain wanders. That makes it difficult to work and very strong once worked. A bedpost of olive, cut from a living stump still rooted in the ground, would not shift, would not rot, and would outlast the roof above it. Bed frames of that age were strung with leather straps laced across the frame in a lattice, with the bedding laid over. The straps stretch with use and are tightened from stretch to time. That is what he was describing to her, not a poem, a joinery method. It is the most ordinary carpentry in the world, and it was the one thing on the whole island that could not be faked. 20 years later, he came back. We are not going to tell the end of the homecoming. It is loud, and it belongs to the daytime, and you already know the shape of it. We are going to skip to the part afterwards, when the house was quiet again. She would not believe it was him. It does not sound like a homecoming. That is worth sitting with, because it is very strange and very true. Everyone else had recognized him by then. His son, the old swineherd, his own dog, the nurse who had known him as a child, who found the scar on his leg while washing his feet. Her son shouted at her for being cold. He said her heart was hard. She said nothing much to that. She sat very still. She had been waiting 20 years, and in that season, a great many men had told her a great many things, and she had learned the exact shape of a lie. So she set a test, and it was a very domestic one. She said to the servant in front of him that the bed should be moved out of the room and made up outside the door with fresh bedding. That is all she said. It is not a trap that sounds like one. It sounded like hospitality. And he answered before he could stop himself. He said, "Who moved my bed?" Then he told her how it was made, the tree, the room built around it, the trunk cut and trimmed and drilled, the leather straps. He described the woodwork of a bed, in detail, angrily, like a man whose life's one piece of carpentry has been tampered with. And that was the proof. It is not the proof anyone expects. Not a scar, not a name, not a story about monsters or storms or islands. A fact about a piece of furniture that two people in the world knew. Her knees went, and she crossed the room, and that is where the 20 years ended. The old accounts say something lovely here. They say that when she finally held him, it was the way people feel who have swum a slow way and come out onto land, that the sea is behind them at last, and the ground is under them, and they can hardly believe the salt is off their skin. Then they went to bed. That is the ending. Two middle-aged people in a room with a tree in it, going to bed. And here is the last detail, and it is the reason we came all this way tonight. There is one more thing worth saying about that house before we let it go. It had stood empty of him for 20 years, and it had not fallen down. Somebody had swept it. Somebody had kept the storerooms and counted the jars of oil and mended the doors when the hinges went. That is true of every house in every story like this one. The building keeps standing because people who are never named keep it standing. The nurse, the swineherd, the women at the mill, the man who watched the goats on the hill above the harbor. None of them traveled anywhere. None of them are in the songs. They simply went on doing the small daily work in the same rooms for 2 decades on the chance that it would matter one day. It did. They did not sleep at first. The house was still. They talked. She told him everything that had happened in the house over 20 years. All of it. The people at the tables, the loom, the undoing of the cloth. He told her everything that had happened to him. The beach at the end of the fighting. The island of sweet fruit, the cave. The bag and the 9 days. The hall with the butter-colored lamps. The gray shore where his mother told him to take note of everything so he could tell her about it later. The singing he heard tied to a mast. The 7 years on the rock. The 17 nights on the raft with the stars on his left hand. He told her all of it in order, lying down in the dark. That is recorded. He tells her the whole story in bed at night, and it takes hours, and neither of them sleeps until it is finished. Everything you have heard tonight, he told her in that room. And when he had finished, and there was nothing left to say, they slept. The old accounts say the night was held back for them and made longer so that they could have it. That is a kind thing for a story to do. You do not have to stay awake for the rest. The house was quiet and still. The tree was in the wall. The bed did not move. The journey was quiet by then. It did not need to be told again. It only needed to be told once, all the way through, in the dark, to the one person who had been waiting for it. You do not need to remember anything you heard tonight. There will be no questions in the morning. If one small room of the past stayed with you, let that be enough. And if nothing stayed, that is fine too. The past does not mind being forgotten. It goes on quietly either way. If you are still with us, thank you for staying. If you have already drifted off, thank you for that too. The world has been turning for a very long time. It turned for all those great nights on the water, and it turned through 20 years in a stone house, and it has gone on turning ever since. Tonight, it can turn without you. You are allowed to rest. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Midnight Archive.